za приглашение. Очень рад встретить с людьми. I will speak in English, but we can have discussion in Russian and in English. Is my speech clear? Everybody happy?
Yeah, it's
okay. The theme today, I want to open up open questions about the legal context of medicine. And though I will talk about what looks like a specialist area of psychiatric judgment in the legal system, in fact, it illustrates very significant issues for the history of medicine. Whatever medicine does is within a legal framework. And the whole modern definition of the shape of the practice of medicine is legally constructed. And I want to illustrate this by talking in three parts. My paper's in three parts. The first part, I think it's necessary to say something very general about the legal framework, and particularly about the nature of the Anglo-American common law, which is so distinctly different from codified law. In the second part, I'll say something specifically about the insanity defense and its history. And in the third part of the paper, which is definitely the most exciting, I will describe a particular case. It's very striking in the legal area that there are extremely good resources for historians because of the written record of legal systems. And in the area of the law of insanity, there is the attraction of doing historical work that many individual cases are extremely emotionally as well as intellectually challenging, and that they make extremely good stories. And I will try and illustrate this literary character of medical history in the context of discussing one particular case in the third part of my paper. Now, can we have the next slide, please? In the first part, as I've mentioned, all of medicine medical practice is framed in modern world within a legal context. This leaves extremely rich resources for historians. And you can look at particular cases in the law rather in the way that a historian of medicine might look at clinical cases, individual cases, as a way of understanding general practice. There is a relationship between the highly particular of an individual trial and any generalization we might want to make about the development of legal medicine, just as there's a relationship between clinical cases and anything we might want to say about the development of scientific medicine. Now, let me turn to the nature of the legal frameworks. And I want to contrast the common law framework, which is dominant, which is the structure of English and following English law, American law, which was modeled on English law in origin. And the continental European system, which since the late 18th century, and particularly by the middle of the 19th century, is dominated by codified legal systems. And this contrast opens up interesting possibilities for comparative history. The common law, as it's called in English, the obše prava, the common law, is a system based upon historical rationality. That is, that past experience is the best guide to current practice. And it builds up its decision-making on what decisions have been taken in the past. And it is associated since the late 18th century with a strongly adversarial system of reaching decisions. That is, that decisions in courts are taken by contrasting two positions, one for and one against an argument. And the outcome is then judged by a jury. That is, it's also associated with the jury system. Note here that the decision-making procedure is not expert, it's taken by ordinary people, given evidence presented to them by two sides. In the case of the criminal court, by on one side the prosecution and on the other side the defense. And it means that when doctors contribute to the decision-making process, they do so, they are brought in as expert medical witnesses, but they contribute to one side of the case or the other side of the case. The doctor's own self-understanding of their knowledge as neutral, objective and scientific is not accepted by the court. In the actual setting of the court, the doctor is a witness for one side of an argument or the other side of the argument. And this historically has placed doctors often in very uncomfortable position in which they felt that their professional credentials have not been properly recognized in public. I'm generalizing, but this is the broad framework. If we turn to codified law, which we find across continental Europe and of course including Russia, you have a system which is based, as it is claimed, on on formal rational principles. There are certain principles of jurisprudence, and on the basis of those principles, there are procedures for reaching decisions which courts must follow. And the decisions that courts must take are presented to them by an investigative body, the procurator or the investigative magistrate in France. And it is then the court, in the form of the judge, who takes the decision about who reaches the judgment. That is, the system of judgment appeals much more professional. It's in the hands of legal experts from the beginning. And the final decision, except where juries have been introduced, which, as you know, in Russia has hardly happened. It can happen, but mostly doesn't happen. The decision-making is taken by experts, not by ordinary people. Now, in this context, the doctors are brought in by the prosecutor, by the procurator, or by the judge as experts to help the court take a decision. And that is, the doctors are not exposed to public examination. They are exposed to private examination, and they feel much more comfortable in this context, because it appears to them that in that context, they are more likely to have their objective, scientific, professional expertise recognized. This is the image. Now, what we also have to recognize is that the English-American common law system is closely linked to the development of liberal political system, which emphasizes the legal commitment to the rights, obligations of the individual. Whereas continental codified systems have their origins in systems of state governance in the 18th century associated with absolutism. They are systems which are much more closely tied to the to governance and to the administration of governance. This has had large consequences in Russia, as you will know better than I. Now, in the common law system, which is what I'm going to talk about because I'm talking about England, which is where I've done in the past, long time ago, but have done extensive research. The medical witness first entered the courts in relation to insanity rather late, in the late 18th century. And it's really only by about the 1830s, in the middle period of the 19th century, when the medical witness becomes the key witness in cases to do with insanity. In the earlier period, in English common law, judgments about insanity, whether in criminal law or in civil law, were taken not specially involving medical evidence. They were based upon, and I'll return to this when I discuss insanity, they were based upon evidence that was publicly available, evidence in terms of people's behavior and past history. Now, having, next slide, please. Having drawn a contrast between the common law and the codified law systems, I want to emphasize that in the modern period, say from the late 19th century into the present, and very much in the present, the contrast is much less great. That is the development in England and America of administrative structures in relation to medicine, and particularly in relation to mentally ill people, has involved doctors in the decision-making process, not in the courts, but in administration. And in this way, English and American doctors have become part of the processes of social governance, just as their colleagues have within the continental European system. And in the modern period, 20th century and now, the court case that involves public medical evidence about insanity is relatively rare. Great majority of decision-making is taken through well-established administrative procedures in which psychiatrists have an accepted professional role. And social administration takes its decision in the light of existing legislation. And it's largely uncontroversial. There are all sorts of questions that might be raised, but it's not much of matter for public discussion. But every so often, there are spectacular cases involving trials where there is an issue of insanity, which arouse very considerable public attention. The most recent spectacular trial of this kind took place in Norway in 2012, with the trial of the mass murderer, Anders Berringa Breyvik. And we can talk about that case later. But it's a case which involved a question of insanity. And it was, of course, extremely public. It was a traumatic public moment within Norwegian society. And these spectacular trials ensure that discussion of insanity in the law remains highly controversial, much discussed, even though in administrative terms, most decisions are taken on a daily basis according to standard institutionalized procedures. In the English system, the most used procedures have grown out of what used to be called the pre-trial, what is called the pre-trial assessment, and the judgment in the pre-trial assessment that a person, owing to their state of mind, is not in a fit case to be tried, and the decision that they are taken out of the court system into the administrative medical system is taken prior to any appearance in court. This is where most of the decision making goes on. As I say, in private, where the doctor's expertise is accepted. Let me turn now, next slide, please. To the second part of my paper. And here I'm going to talk specifically about, I haven't so far really discriminated civil law and criminal law. I'm now going to talk specifically about criminal law after a few comments. And it will explain the history of the English insanity defense, as it's called. Now, the English law has concerned itself with the insane from medieval times. But the great majority of decision-making about people we might recognize as insane was taken until the early 19th century within the context of the administration of poverty. That is, in the early period, it's impossible to separate medical decision-making about the insane and decision-making about the poor. Except in the very specific case of questions about the insanity of people with property. And from Norman times, after the Norman invasion through till the present, there are sometimes cases involving debate about the mental ability of a person with considerable wealth to administer that wealth in a rational way. And these cases, because they involve money, have often resulted in substantial legal disputes, and they still can do. And I can illustrate these cases if you like later, but I won't. They can involve considerable public exposure of what counts as insanity. You can see how that might be if you have a very rich person who spends all of his money on gambling. That is, the family feels that it's losing all its money because of gambling. The family might well wish to try and claim that the person's mad in some way to protect the money. That's the kind of case that's still possible. Now, we come then to the area that I want to talk about, the Ugolovny Zakon. And above all, the защита по невменяемости, the insanity defense, as it's called in England. Here, we're talking about the criminal law, not about the civil law. Next slide, please. The criminal law has, again, since Roman times, developing in England in Anglo-Saxon and then in Norman law, adopting elements of the Roman system, understood that for there to be a crime, to convict somebody of a crime, there are two basic requirements. The first is simply that the person did what is claimed they did. They did the action. This in Latin is the actus reus. But secondly, and for our purposes, what matters is that the person who did the crime has to have a certain state of mind in order to be judged guilty and responsible. And this is very understandable when you consider the issue of children. Children are not held responsible for criminal acts below a certain age. In the past, there were large areas of law in which women were not held responsible because they had legal standing as possessions of their husbands, or were, in the French phrase, femme couverte, that is, they were covered by their husbands. And it's the husbands who were responsible for their actions. And of course, there are also the category of mentally ill people who have, from very early on, been on occasions judged not to be responsible for what they've done. And it's important to see that in law, children and mad people are very similar in this respect, is that what they lack is a certain state of mind. And in the case of children, it's very interesting because with children, you can immediately see where the problem for the insanity defense lies. At what age does a child start to become responsible in legal terms? And different countries draw the age in different ways. Similarly, we have the question, what degree of abnormality of mind qualifies a person not to be responsible? And again, there are different practices around this. And you can see clearly where the issues lie with the familiar problem of alcohol and of crimes committed under the influence of alcohol. To what degree is a person's responsibility changed, if changed at all, by the fact that they are drunk? Because after all, earlier they allowed themselves to become drunk, and therefore can be said that they are responsible. Even if, when drunk, they are blind drunk, as people say in English, that is, smashed, completely unable to control their actions. Next slide, please. Now, I want now to discuss the introduction of medical evidence in relation to the insanity defense. Its origins, as I've said, are early. And until at least the late 18th century, a judgment in court about whether or not somebody was, whether there was an absence of mens rea, whether somebody was not in a mental condition to be responsible, was a judgment made according to common sense, an ordinary person's understanding of madness. And there were, broadly speaking, two kinds of tests that the court applied. Firstly, what is called the wild beast test. That is the person just so obviously abnormal and behaving like an animal, not like a human being, that they don't have a responsible state of mind? Are they like a wild beast? And more importantly, much more importantly, there is what is called the right-wrong test. And this again is not a medical test. The test is an ordinary person's test. Did the person know what they were doing? Did they have an understanding of their action? Did they intend to do it? Did they have purpose? And juries in the English system took decisions about somebody not being responsible on the ground of insanity using this test. They asked questions that anybody with a degree of education can understand. Does somebody know the difference between right and wrong? We would say a 3-year-old child does not, and a 16-year-old teenager does, normally. Now, the right-wrong test then became built into codified law in the Code Napoleon of 1810, the criminal code of 1810, and it became formalized unusually in English law, which generally lacks formality, in what are called the Mcnaughton Rules of 1843. And these rules in England lay it down that the jury must reach its decision about responsibility by asking whether the person accused knew the difference between right and wrong in relation to the act when they were committing it. And these rules were then seen at the time, just as the rules in the Napoleonic Code were seen at the time, as not acceptable to many doctors. Doctors objected that the decision was being taken on common sense grounds, not on grounds of the expert knowledge of doctors. An expert knowledge of doctors, they then argued, was that many individuals did know the difference between right and wrong, did know what they were doing, but were compelled to do what they did. That is, they were in a state where they had no choice but to do what they did. And this is where the controversy over the insanity defense really centers. Where the doctors were saying there are people who cannot help what they do, they have an illness. For the public, these people are precisely people who are bad. And hence you get in cases involving the insanity defense, in the English system, a public debate about whether to call somebody bad or mad. And as I'll try and explain in due course, this can be a very emotional, very symbolic, very heavily symbol-laden and effectively laden public theatrical activity, judging, making this kind of decision. People get very worked up about it. And hence, these cases, though they're unusual, create lots of controversy. Okay. Now, in the early 19th century, there aren't set procedures for dealing with these issues. Gradually, these set procedures get built into administration, particularly, as I've already emphasized, the way in which it becomes possible to take decisions about insanity before the case reaches the court. And so the modern history of the insanity defense is the history of the gradual lessening of use of the defense and the removal of cases from the dramatic setting of the court to the administrative system. Also in England, you have to recognize that in relation to murder cases, to the most spectacular criminal cases, until 1957 in England, a person who was accused of murder was either found guilty of murder or not guilty of murder. There was no in-between condition. But this was then introduced into England following Scottish example. Scottish law is different than English law. In 1957. And now, in modern English courts, the insanity defense is not used. What is used is the defense of diminished responsibility. Everybody agrees, person did something, committed a murder. They agree that they have a state of disturbed mind, but they don't have to judge whether that person is mad or not mad. They can judge diminished responsibility. And this is a very helpful legal and much used way of dealing with cases. The further administrative development that I must mention is that beginning in the early 19th century, associated with the spread of the asylum system for the insane in general, England introduced special hospitals, now called special hospitals, and they were previously called criminal lunatic asylums, to take people who have been found to have committed crimes, but to be not guilty on the grounds of insanity. That is, there's a development of special institutions to house securely this group of people who are found not guilty by reason of insanity. And the first of these institutions is in England is a special part of the old medieval hospital, Bedlam, in 1815. And then the first special hospital for the criminally insane, Broadmoor, built in 1863. And Broadmoor is still functioning in England, what is called a secure hospital. Next slide, please. Now, I've tried to emphasize that there is public interest in this area of medical legal decision making. One reason why this is the case is that with murder trials in England until 1965, the result of conviction for murder was capital punishment, execution. It was not usually carried out, but the trial of whether a person was insane or not insane in relation to a murder was a trial about whether that person might be hanged. That is, it's a very emotional area. And England abolished capital punishment for murder in 1965. And this has helped reduce controversy over insanity. Then I want to emphasize, and I've mentioned this, that the trial about whether somebody is mad or bad is highly symbolic in political society. It seems the individual trial becomes a symbol of whether or not society in general is committed to defense of people who've suffered, to retribution, and to preventing dangerous crimes, or whether society is committed more sympathetically to assisting, caring for people who appear to suffer from medical or perhaps just personality problems. And so there's a lot at stake in one particular trial. It's not just a trial about a person, it's a trial about public policies. And this leads me to say that the contemporary English debate since 1983, since the early 1980s, with the Thatcher Conservative government, the move to neoliberal, so-called neoliberal political positions, has involved a shift away from using the law to move the law away from associating the judgments about insanity with protecting the ill, towards a policy of protecting the public. The concern these days is with risk, and with the risk from mentally ill people. This is what's driving political policy. Whatever the particular case, as I'm trying to emphasize, whatever's the evidence in a particular case, there is always in the background a general political discussion about where responsibility should lie, on the individual or on society. And this is a highly divisive political question in liberal societies, particularly at present. Then I want to draw attention to the public interest in the adversarial system that you find in Britain and America, of medical witnesses appearing on both sides of the argument. Where there is a lot of money involved, as in a decision about the administration of a person's property, or whether it's a spectacular murder and everybody's interested in what happens, when then there are medical witnesses saying this person is mad or this person is not mad, and some doctors say one thing and some doctors say another, the public sees disagreement and controversy among doctors. And this raises questions about the scientific standing of medicine, and it can greatly embarrass doctors. In fact, very interesting questions about the objectivity of science in legal systems, but that's subject for another talk. Now, I also, in a final comment, want to raise what I think is something I'd like to think more about, and that is the use of the word mad, not as a medical term, but as an anthropological term. And this is really the way the word mad was often used in the past, and I think often still is, that we describe something as mad when we mean it's just completely not the thing to do. It's completely exceptional, it's monstrous, it's outside the normal range. And of course, in the modern age, we tend to attribute such completely strange, unusual, unacceptable practices to illnesses. But the word mad can still mean monstrous. we say, about a particular policy or a particular decision is just mad, we say. What we mean, I think, is not that it's medically diseased or ill, but that it's monstrous. It's outside the normal range of activity. And I want to illustrate this. Please, if we go to the next slide. Before we come to a particular case where I will illustrate what I want to say, let me just note there are a number of famous trials which anybody who works in this area knows about. There's a trial of James Hadfield in 1800. He shot at George III, the king, in the theatre, and was tried for treason, and was then acquitted on the grounds, was found not guilty because of his insanity. And in fact, he could only then still be held in custody under the Poor Laws. And this led to legislation for criminal lunatic asylums. There's a case of Pierre Rivière in France, made famous by Foucault in a book published in 1973. Pierre Rivière killed his mother, his sister, his brother, and then wrote an extraordinary 50-page document about why he did the killing. So you had the case of a man who wrote a brilliant discussion of his own reasons for murder, who was then found insane. There's a trial of Daniel Mcnaughton, which formalized the English rules, 1843. He was acquitted on grounds of insanity. There's a famous case of child murder in Italy, Carlino Grandi of 1876, which has been studied by Patrizia Guarneri. Coming into the recent past, I myself commented on a case in the early 1980s in Britain, the trial of Peter Sutcliffe, who was also known as the Yorkshire Ripper. And he was tried for the murder of 14 women, extremely violent, appalling killings of women. And there was a very controversial trial because the attempt was made by doctors to prevent it coming to trial. They said he was clearly paranoid schizophrenic. All the doctors agreed he was paranoid schizophrenic. But then the public was so disturbed and the politicians were so disturbed that there was in fact a trial. And at the trial, this man whom all the doctors had called schizophrenic was found guilty of murder. That is, was found sane and guilty. That was what politicians and the public wanted. And it raised a whole host of questions about a relationship between expert decision-making and public decision-making. At the same time, there was the attempt to kill President Reagan in 1981, the case of John Hinckley. He was a man who attempted to attract the attention of the film star Jodie Foster by committing a spectacular crime. His acquittal on the ground of insanity caused a lot of changes in American law. The public was extremely upset that he was acquitted. And then there's the case, the terrible, appalling case of the extreme nationalist Breivik in 2011, who was guilty of killing 77 people, mainly teenagers. Let me now come, next slide, please. I want to come and illustrate with one specific case. I won't say anything about this slide. I think I've covered these points. Next slide, please. The case is the case of a young woman, about 17 or 18, Martha Brixey, 1845. Now, I've written about this case, but done some research on it, but as I'll explain at the end, there's more research to be done. Now, the interest of this case is she was a young servant girl in a household in London who one morning went to the kitchen, took a carving knife, a very large meat knife, and cut the head off a young child in the family. She did this without warning, but she took the knife, killed the child, and then told the father what she had done. That is, here you had a young woman who was able to reason, to be alone with the child with a sharp knife, to kill it, then to report to the father what she'd done, and even to ask when she was investigated whether or not she would be hanged. That is, she behaved like a rational human being in planning, in showing purpose. But she carried out what we would ordinarily call a mad act, an act that is so monstrous that it lies outside our normal range of understanding. Now, at her trial, there was medical evidence for the prosecution case, that she was bad, that she had planned it, and that she could understand clearly what she was doing and therefore should be found guilty. And there was medical evidence for the defense, saying that she was a young woman, that young women were well known often to be disturbed by internal disorders within their reproductive system, and that this young woman indeed had disordered menstruation. And as a result, when she did the crime, she was not in a state to understand the nature of what she was doing. And there was a background which influences probably the outcome of the case, of the public being aware of young men, of special relations between young women and children, which sometimes resulted in extreme crimes, in child murder. But the public was also aware that this was a young servant in an ordinary middle-class house who suddenly killed the child. And if she wasn't punished, then what would other young servants do? That is, the public was afraid of the risk factor. They had to protect the family by punishing her, was the public view. Next slide, please. Well, the outcome of this case, which went to the jury, was that the jury found her not guilty on the grounds of insanity. As a result, she was sent to Bethlehem Hospital as a criminal lunatic. She stayed in this criminal lunatic asylum for 13 years, and she was then released in 1858, described as a woman of perfectly good behavior, showing no signs of insanity. And nothing more is known of her. Now, the jury took a decision to acquit her. We don't know why the jury takes a decision. Jury decisions are secret. They're protected by law in England. But we can imagine that the jury had sympathy for a young woman who did something so completely outside the ordinary that it had to be mad. And they therefore accepted medical evidence that she was mad rather than accepting medical evidence that she wasn't. Now, And the jury also acted in this way because they didn't want her to be hanged. That is, they feared that if they didn't acquit her on the grounds of insanity, she might have been executed. That they were not prepared to accept. Now, I want to just speculate and raise, I thought a lot about why this young woman might have done what she did. And it's interesting that in her, and I leave this for you to judge, in her own statements, she said that she killed the child. This is an interesting phrasing. She killed the child in order to make an angel of the child. That is, she killed the child to keep it pure, to save it from the dirt and immorality of this world, to send it into the next where it would have a pure life. Now, this is the perception of a young servant. And we know something about the situation of young female servants. And I also want to add to this an idea that I got from reading a famous writer, a Swiss writer, who, sorry, his name will come back to me in just a second. But he referred me to a well-known novel in the end of the 19th century by a Swiss writer, Johannes Spiri. And some of you may know this novel, Heidi. It's an extremely sentimental account, really it's more suitable for children. We would find it much too sentimental. But it's about a young girl who is brought up in her home in the mountains and is then sent to be a servant in a town. And she suffers, deeply suffers from disorientation and from what is called nostalgia. And I think it's the case, and can be argued, that many young women servants in the 19th century suffered in this way. And we might therefore want to speculate that in the case of Martha Brycie, we might have such a case of a woman who is so distressed by the displacement of her life that she carries out a mad action. Now, you can comment on this, on my view of this. Let me come to the final. I'm taking up rather a lot of time. I'll stop very soon. Next slide, please. The Martha Brycie's case takes place at a crucial moment in the development of English history of asylums. 1845, the year in which Martha Brycie is tried, is also the year in which English Parliament passes a law making it compulsory for every region to establish an asylum for the insane. That is, her trial is just at the moment when society is establishing what it sees as a medically reforming movement, building public asylums. So her trial takes place at the time when there is a public consciousness of reform. At the same time, 1841, we see the foundings of the professional medical organization of specialists in the area of insanity, the Association of Medical Officers in asylums and hospitals for the insane, which becomes the Medico-Psychological Association in 1865, and is now the Royal College of Psychiatry. That is, the trial takes place at the time of the founding of the modern psychiatric profession in England. Also, it takes place at a time when there is the beginnings of debate, which still continues, and I don't have time to talk about, the relationship between new claims about scientific medicine, new knowledge of the brain, and illnesses which are said to be responsible for mad actions. And this is a public dispute in the mid-19th century, as it now is again in the context of debate about the relationship between the neurosciences and the question of free will. To my concluding slide, please. Just let me summarize what I've tried to say, a number of complex issues. But what I'd like to be most clear about is that we can look at the history in terms of several different levels of analysis. And that if we are to understand a case like Martha Brix's, and also modern cases like Breivik's or the trial of Peter Sutcliffe, we have to work at several different levels of analysis. Firstly, there are the details of particular cases, and particularly within the Anglo-American system of common law, there is the local detailed circumstances of a case can have great influence on the outcome. You cannot generalize about outcomes. You have to know the details of the particulars. This is less true of codified law systems, where decision-making, even in relation to spectacular cases, is more under the control of systems of administration. The second level of analysis concerns the institutional background. We have to understand the nature of legal systems. We have to understand the history of administrative systems, and we have to understand the relationship of those administrative systems to government, and to traditions of government, bearing between absolutism on the one hand and liberalism on the other. Third level analysis, we have to recognize that when there is a judgment about insanity, it involves an assessment of the value of medical scientific knowledge, which is deterministic knowledge, which explains things in terms of physical or other causes. And that has to somehow be related to ordinary people's ordinary speech and legal decision-making, which attributes free will and intention and purpose to people. That's another level of analysis in which I've worked a good deal. And it's in the book. My thoughts of this go back a long way, and I just list here the book I published in 1981 on this topic, many years ago. But the issues have not, in substance, changed. And lastly, I would like to say there's a level of analysis where the historian can look at what he or she is doing in writing up a story about a particular case, as I've tried to do with Martha Brixey. What story do we as historians want to tell? Where do we wish to place the emphasis? And do we wish to give back to somebody like Martha Brixey her own voice? It's very striking that in her trial, nobody at the trial asked her what she thought about what had happened. Her voice was only mediated by doctors. That seems to me very interesting, and we would want to ask questions as historians about why that was so. But I think I've said a lot, and I would like to stop. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you. Thank you, Roger, for your wonderful talk. I can see if there are. Oh, sorry.
Yes. If I may.
Hello,
yeah, I would like to ask a question on medical evidence that you mentioned in your talk. Yes, concerning Mrs. Brixey, you said that there was medical evidence on both sides. Yes. So what kind of evidence it was?
Yes.
And what is actually meant by medical evidence in the middle of the 19th century? I mean, were there different diagnoses on both sides, from defense or persecution, or could you elaborate on this?
Yes, no, it's a very relevant question. At this time, the experience of using medical evidence is relatively small. There has been, of course, much medical evidence before, but in relation to insanity, the situation is still fairly flexible and open. In Martha Brixey's case, the medical evidence is really very poor, we would want to say, very insubstantial. The prosecution medical evidence, the medical evidence is evidence given by a doctor. That's what constitutes medical evidence. In this case, the doctor who speaks for the prosecution simply says he examined the patient and found her to be sane. That is, he didn't find medical evidence. So his medical evidence is that there's no medical evidence. The defense medical evidence is that she's there is the specific evidence is only that she has, her menstruation is blocked. She has a long history of not just irregular, but abnormal menstruation. And that they take to be sufficient evidence to suggest that her mind is disturbed. And they make that step against the background of general medical opinion that women's mental condition is influenced by their reproductive system. They are much more vulnerable to the mind being influenced by the body than men are. That's all the medical evidence consists of. It's extremely weak in specifics.
So she was not examined by a psychiatrist?
Yes, the medical doctors on both sides are individuals who work in asylums. But they, of course, do not call themselves psychiatrists at this stage. They call themselves specialists in insanity. They are insanity specialists. And the public, and you'll understand the irony of this in English, the public knows them as mad doctors. That is, they are up against a public opinion that does not respect their expertise. And you can see why in this case, given that the defense evidence is of such poor quality. 50 years later, the courts have much more experience and the doctors have much more experience, and the evidence gets better and more sophisticated. This is an early case.
Well, I'm asking this question also because now we are always told about evidence-based medicine, EBM, as you know, and that's why the question is what's meant by evidence.
Yes, indeed, in this case, it's a very real question, and what counts as evidence is highly open-ended at this time.
Yeah, may I?
Yes, please.
Well, Roger, you were talking about two types of legal systems.
Yes.
Yes, one in England and one continental. And how these two legal systems are fit somehow, say, to the government, how it functions, how the society is functioning.
Yes.
I wonder, today, we are living in a new sort of world, this globalized world, where everything is becoming different. Which type of the legal system do you think can be better, well, developing in this new kind of world? If I make myself clear, I
Yes,
wonder.
your question is very clear. I don't think it's a question I can easily answer.
Of course.
Because the world political systems are so divided. Their legal systems go with that division. That is, we can't separate off the legal systems and say, well, this would be the best system, because legal systems exist in relationship with political systems. And therefore, I might have my position. In taking position, I would also state a political position. I think that's impossible to separate them. And any medical claim to say that they can set up a system for decision making in relation to the law, which is independent of politics, is false, in my view. Even though the medical experts may possess a whole body of range of knowledge and experience that other people do not have, that doesn't mean that when they use that knowledge, they are not part of the political process. They are part of the political process, indirectly, but everywhere in different ways. Does that help?
Thank you.
So if I may just briefly, you briefly touched the question of free will. Yes, how the issue of free will was integrated in these debates.
Right.
I'm asking this because just recently I reviewed a book, a Russian translation of a book by Robert Sapolsky, Behave, where he tries, well, there is virtually no room for free will if you read this book. But how did it show itself in these debates on insanity, free will?
Well, this, Slava, is a huge question. It interests me very much, and I have tried to think about this a lot. In the 19th century, say at the time of Martha Brix's case, the public is clear that people have free will. Victorian society is intensely moralistic. People have free will to do good or bad. Mm-hmm. And so that for many people in the public at the time of this trial, the issue is quite straightforwardly, was Martha Brixie in a state where she could choose to do good or bad? Mm-hmm. Or was she in a condition where she had no choice because of illness? And the jury took the latter view because I think for reasons in order that she's not hanged and because of sympathy with young women. But many people in the public thought the verdict was dreadful and they thought that she should have been hanged. So the public itself is divided about whether or not she showed free will. Mm-hmm. Now, my view in relation to present debates is that modern scientific medicine is a way of understanding that does not have room for free will. And there's no free will in a person who does good or in a person who does bad. You do what you do for reasons of the causal, physical characteristics of the body, put it very crudely. But in our ordinary speech, ordinary human relationships, we carry on treating people as having free will. We say to somebody, well, you didn't have to do that. And this is part of our everyday discourse. And it's part of our moral discourse. And it's part of our legal discourse. And therefore, when you have a trial involving insanity, you have two ways of thinking opposed to each other. You have a deterministic way, which is the way of modern scientific medicine. And you have the ordinary persons and the legal way of making judgments about responsibility. Now, you can't, and you have to, the court has to decide which way to jump, whether to accept the deterministic view or the non-deterministic view. Most of the time, the decision is not taken in court, it's taken by the building of the medical perspective into the administrative procedures. The doctors take the decisions, not the courts, before, as part of governance. But when it does come to court, the disagreement can be very sharp. But what should be made clear is that it's not illness per se that makes a person not responsible. Because being ill and not being ill in medical terms are both determined. I mean, the medical discourse of a healthy body is the same deterministic discourse as the medical discourse of a non-healthy body. They are both determined. But the society accepts, we have the convention, we have the tradition of accepting that certain illnesses, certain conditions that people have, like epilepsy, if somebody acts violently when they're in an epileptic fit, we do not hold them responsible. Everybody accepts that. And therefore, the very occasional cases in which somebody does something violent while they're epileptic, and there could be a criminal case, in theory. But we all agree that we don't want to prosecute epileptics. But if we take a case like somebody who overeats, who cannot stop overeating, and then they put up the defense and say, well, I did this criminal act because I can't stop overeating. People turn around and say, oh no, yes, you could stop. In this case, we don't accept the medical evidence. Do you see what I'm trying to say? That it depends on traditionally accepting that certain areas of illness entail non-responsibility. That's our tradition. And other areas of illness do not affect responsibility. And it's constantly open for debate. The boundaries can shift with public opinion, and do shift with public opinion. So enormous, free will is an issue over which everybody gets into a mess. And the questions of responsibility are highly interesting, but confusing, I find. Perhaps there's another question.
Hello, everyone. I'll speak in English. My question is about details of the Martha Brixey case. Was it normal practice then to actually question the family that she was working for? Were there other circumstances that might have pushed her to this, apart from the religious connotations that she said she killed the child in order to make an angel of the child? So there's definitely some kind of religious reasons from on her side.
Yes. No, it's an excellent question. It's very relevant. if I were to do more work on this case, I would go to the newspapers and also to find the trial records, which exist, to try and find out what else was said. That is, I've only read reports in the medical and legal journals about the case, and they report these words from the accused person. And if as historians what we want to do is to understand why she did indeed do it, and many of us would be interested, because that leads to such deep questions about our own nature, we would have to do some very detailed archival work on the particular case. And we might or might not find relevant material, but nobody has looked. I only went so far. I did in one other case go further, looked at all the newspapers and tried to find details. And that was another case of a mother killing children. But we might well come up against the fact that we are dealing with something that's mad. That is, it is outside our normal ways of understanding things. We have such a repertoire of narratives to hand, conventional narratives about why people do what they do. Every so often something does something completely out of the ordinary. And if this is a case like that, we will always be in the business of constructing stories for ourselves about what she did, not knowing why she did it in her own terms.
But aren't all court cases documented as to who said what when exactly, and it's all kind of written down, recorded somehow?
Yes, but in this case, what will be recorded is what the doctors heard her say.
The doctors heard her say, did you say?
Yes, and what the police wrote down. What I don't know that we'll find is the police record of interviewing her and her employers. That would be the best evidence we could find, would be direct records of her statements and statements from the family. And those statements would have been given to the police.
Right.
And whether any of that remains, I doubt. But it might, we could look. But I haven't. This is what good historians do. They go away and spend a year digging in obscure archives.
You might be interested to compare this case to a couple of years ago, case of a young woman from Uzbekistan who cut off a head of a small baby here in Moscow.
Remember this case.
She was also declared mad, and I think it's somewhat similar cases. Interesting to compare them.
I think it would be very interesting. When I do know the case you mentioned, Slava, and when I heard that case, it seemed to me that to draw on the concept of nostalgia, of the dislocation of a young woman who's then having to live in extremely vulnerable circumstances, exposed to exploitation in all sorts of ways, and not having the required documentation and all the rest of the problems. We might wish to recognize as creating stress of the kind that leads to madness. Yes. Yeah, no, it's an interesting, I'd forgotten that, thank you.
There are also questions in chat from Ekaterina Kapranova and Boris Arkadyevich.
Спасибо, знание обо мне. Я не знаю английского, так что мне не стоит занимать время. Благодарю, замечательный доклад.
Я понимаю по-русски. Спасибо.
Спасибо. Вот вы говорили в начале доклада о том, что экспертиза должна быть профессиональной, в данном случае психиатрической, медицинской, а не анализировать обстоятельства дела. Позвольте обратить ваше внимание, почти наверняка вы это знаете, что в России в начале 20 века, в 1911 году, было дело Бейлиса в Киеве.
Да.
Убийство, да, и вот профессор Сикорский, авторитетнейший психиатр, но в своем заключении, остановившийся именно на обстоятельствах дела, расценивший это убийство как еврейское ритуальное, прошу прощения, был подвергнут обструкции не только русской, но и мировой психиатрии, включая великого Ойгена Блюйлера из Швейцарии. Да, и потом мне думается, что вот этот действительно порочный круг, тяжкие преступления и безумие, как их разграничить, разделить можно, развести благодаря трихотомии, которую все мы осознанно или интуитивно лучше всего знаем из христианской антропологии. Дух, душа, тело. Душевные болезни – это душевные, правонарушения или, наоборот, светлые деяния, творчество – это духовная сфера. И действительно нужно увидеть в том или ином деликте проявление бреда, галлюцинаций, ну и каких-то других расстройств. И действительно, безумие – это прежде всего антропологическая проблема. Человечество постепенно додумалось до того, что некоторые видения, голоса не просто какие-то озарения, а именно болезнь. Да. Повторяю, антропологическая проблема преступности, психические аномалии, творчество и психическая патология, религиозность и психические расстройства. Все это проблемы, конечно, антропологические. И действительно, я совершенно согласен с вашим заключением, что форма объяснения человеческих действий, здравый смысл, юридические, медицинские, религиозные подходы, они не совпадают. Это разные точки зрения. Спасибо огромное за доклад.
Спасибо за комментарий. Да, I think your point well illustrates that we have to look at local context. These very dramatic cases we can't generalize about. There are very special circumstances. In the case, the famous, terrible case that you mentioned, this is certainly so. And I think it's true with recent trials. Well, we haven't talked about the Norwegian case, for example, but they're very special circumstances about what happened. But historians have a great advantage in that through their methods of dealing with particulars, they're particularly well equipped, I think, to understand the complexities of these cases, of these individual cases.
May I also ask a question? It rather concerns the legal history than the history of medicine. Do I understand correctly that in a criminal law, in the criminal court of common law, there is no judge but the jury?
No.
No, there is the judge.
Yes, most certainly there is a judge. But the judge's job is and the jury's job are carefully defined. It is the judge's job to ensure that the law is understood and applied. Mm-hmm. But it is the jury's job to decide the facts of what happened.
Yes, I understand. And the second question, for example, if one of the insane criminals, the criminals who were defended on the grounds of insanity, if one of them was convicted, did he have the opportunity to appeal? What were what was the system of appellate courts of the United system for such kind of cases?
I can't answer precisely for the present. The answer is no. In the 19th century, there was no appeal.
I see.
But the appeal system was developing in the 19th century, and I think that there is now a system of appeals. But once a person is found judged insane, either before trial or in the trial now, they become a criminal lunatic, to use the old words.
Mm-hmm.
And they, as any person who is certified insane, there is a procedure of appeals for saying that they have been falsely judged. That certainly exists. All people certified insane have this procedure, in theory, available to them.
Mm-hmm, I see.
How well it works is a highly controversial question in relation to the current administration of the mentally ill in Britain.
I see. Thank you very much.
Mm.
There are no more questions in chat, and as I can see, oh, Sevelet, do you have a question or a comment? Oh, yeah, good. Thank you very much for a wonderful talk and for a wonderful discussion, and thank you for putting all these perspectives from the point of view of the history of law, the history of psychiatry and psychology, and this anthropological focus that the background of a person also means, and bad and good in different cultures and different backgrounds might seem and mean different things. And maybe it is it is the structure for looking on cases today, when there are so many people from all over the world in not familiar not familiar surroundings for them. So maybe it's the way we should look on crimes and deeds. Thank you for the discussion and for answering so many questions.
Well, thank you very much, Marcia, for organizing this, and thank you all very much for listening.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
Many thanks.
Bye-bye. До свидания.
Thank you.
До свидания.